Hi and welcome back to Supply Chain Secrets. I thought I'd do something different over the next 2 or 3 weeks. Now, you may or may not know that we run a whole series of seminars. We're based in Australia, but also around Southeast Asia. And I took some videos at some recent seminars that we held where a number of our specialists here at Logistics Bureau were covering different topics. So rather than just listen to me every week, I thought we should listen to them. This week, we've got John Cole. Now, John is recognized as one of the leading experts on freight in Australia. He's been consulting in freight for donkey's years, and this session, which we recently recorded, he's talking about all of the issues, the challenges that people have and some of the mistakes they make in dealing with freight companies, and that's coming right up.
Anybody in the room started a new job, got a promotion, and found pretty soon that that job wasn't what they thought it might be? I don't mean in a good way. I don't mean your own personal assistant that you didn't expect to get, but rather than nod, a few people put their hands up that had done that. Okay. How about a situation so bad that you had an oh shit moment? A few of those too? Yep, okay. Well, Steve is one of those people. Steve is memorable more so than the company that he worked for and the project because of the situation that I found Steve in when I went to see him. He had been a long-term procurement professional in a large organisation. It was a divisional, 4 divisions in the organisation, and Steve was a category manager in one of those divisions. And recently he had been promoted to the transport category manager across all of the divisions, so for the whole corporation. So at the time Steve got me in, he'd been in the job for about perhaps a month. So came in, we sat down and we went through the usual pleasantries and we talked about the business. And Steve very quickly wanted to jump to what his challenge was. And so he was surprisingly candid. He said, we've estimated that we spend $36 million on transport. He said, the way we know that is that some very clever company with algorithms or some kind of thing has gone through hundreds of thousands of creditor transactions and identified the ones that are freight. But the reality is that we don't know how we spend that $36 million. We don't know how well we spend that $36 million. And looking a bit sheepish, he said, and really we don't know who spends that $36 million. So we pretty quickly got down to what Steve had me there for. I nearly said John, that's his real name. So this was Steve's situation. So I thought this pretty much sums up Steve in his situation. So initially we had the conversation and I took a whole lot of notes and came back not too long later and spoke with Steve and his boss. And the way that we convinced Steve's boss that we could help and that we could, if you like, untangle his great pile of rope. Notice there are no religious jokes or puns, and I promise you there'll be none in this presentation. So there are sins in here, but I'm sure you can identify them without me pointing them out. But the way we got Steve's boss to accept that we knew what we were doing was to convince him that really there's only so many ways that you can look at problems in transport. There are only so many avenues of opportunity, or if you want to reverse it, there are only so many ways you can tangle yourself up. And these are the 7 that I've put together over time, a long time, as you can probably guess, and they've always turned out to be pretty true. I haven't found, as much as I've looked and as much as people have challenged, and feel free, I haven't found another category. Excuse me. So by the time that we convinced Steve's boss that we could help, Steve then handed over to me, very solemnly, a memory stick and said, everything you need is on there. So went back to the office and not all that hopeful, loaded the stick, opened it up, and there was a single file there. There was something like a 30 meg file of hundreds of thousands of transactions, or in this case, tens of thousands of transactions that were freight related. So, moving ahead and looking in hindsight, what we found with Steve was that in his business, 4 of these particular categories were relevant. And these are the ones that I want to take you through today. Now, before I move on to that, how many people only, and you may be reluctant to put your hands up, so let's say how many people work for organisations who seem to have the attitude that only price matters, that price is the only way to cost reduction? We're all smarter than that? Okay. This must be the room full of the other 26%, because my findings, my very scientific findings, are that 74% of companies only look to price to reduce cost. Okay, so the first we're going to look at is volume leveraging, I should say. And you would think that, given that Steve had a bucket of $36 million, he's well on his way and he'd have some great leveraging going on, but no, that was not at all the case. What we found was that Steve had, and I'll keep saying Steve had because Steve had the responsibility for it, but his company he had inherited 147 carriers with more than 250 accounts. Now that's not the record. The record that I've encountered and worked on is 250 carriers, and I didn't bother with the number of accounts, it kind of seemed irrelevant. But that was with a chemical company, and that tends to be typical of companies that acquire other businesses that are quite diversified. But what made it worse was, and the reason you get 250 odd accounts with 147 carriers is because this branch goes and engages that carrier, this branch goes and engages that carrier as well. They've got their rates, they've got their rates. So that was the situation with Steve. And the reason for that, as I've alluded to, is that it was a very, let's say, entrepreneurial kind of business. There was a lot of autonomy in the business. There were 4 divisions and they all had their own autonomy to make decisions the way they wanted. There were states that could then make their own decisions. There were branches that could then make their own decisions. And overlying that, there were projects. This was very much a project-based type of business. And for each project, if you think it through, freight quite often is fairly incidental to a $500 million project or whatever that involves large infrastructure or things of this nature. Bringing pieces to Australia that, some of the pieces this company brought to Australia were 200 tonne. So freight was incidental, so it was almost like afterthought, let's go and Google who's in the area, who can do heavy haulage, who can do this, who can do that. And that's how they got the carriers that they needed. Steve also told me that they stretched, if you like, the capabilities, the services of the people they did use. So we found that there were crane truck businesses that put on a ute to go and do some hotshot courier services that the company happened to need, and they had a good relationship with the branch. And the more usual one of sending express freight with a general carrier and you're saying, look, just make sure you get this loaded on today, and these types of things. So there was, if you like, a cobbling together of services based on who was there and who I had a good relationship with. And this is particularly prevalent in country areas, and this was relevant to this particular business. So when we had a look at it, objectively, we found that there were 8 different markets that Steve's business drew from. So when I talk about markets, we're talking about sub-markets, if you like, in the industry. So we're talking about who does heavy haulage, who does local courier, who does express freight, who does break bulk shipping, who does, and who does. So we found that there were 8 markets. Then we had the discussion around, okay, so what do we do with that? There's, if you like, 2 competing considerations here. They are consolidation and differentiation. So the advice that we gave to Steve was you need to differentiate, you need to understand what has to be differentiated. And on what basis do you differentiate? You differentiate on the basis of typically the handling needs, your service offer to your company, to your customers. So once you've worked out what has to be treated in a particular way and is different from the way other freight is treated, then that is differentiated in terms of a service that you go looking for. Everything else, presumably, has the same handling requirements, has the same service offer requirements, and can be consolidated. With $36 million to spend, that should be a high consideration for Steve's company to see how much of that $36 million can go into 1 or 2 or 3 buckets, putting aside the $1 million here, $3 million there, they're spending on crane trucks and heavy haulage and so forth. So that was the advice that we gave in terms of consolidation. So we got to, as we will with each of these, we got to understanding the situation, understanding the predicament, if you like, or the wrong path that Steve's business was going down, and then talking about a simple approach. And the simple approach, by simple I mean it's an approach that Steve can adapt himself. He doesn't need me to come in and actually carry it out. He needs to understand the logic, he needs to understand the rationale, the approach, and then go ahead and implement that. So the next opportunity that we found was task and resource matching. And by resource, I mean not only do we use this sort of truck, do we use that, do we need refrigeration, but also gets back to this issue of the markets and the people that you approach in the market to do certain things. Most companies, most people in the service provider market, if you go to them, unless you're way out in left field, they will try to accommodate. They will say, yeah, we can do that. Yeah, we'll do that for you. What they mean is, I'll give it a try. That's not what you should be looking for. So, this is a common situation. You know your own carriers very well. In the case of Steve's organisation, because the relationships were down at such a low level, and there was quite a prevalence of country towns involved here. These were people you drank at the pub with. These are people who you went to the footy with, you had barbecues with. So you were going to, first of all, you knew what they could do, you were going to be lenient with what they couldn't do, and you really had no incentive to go and look for what was out there as an alternative, or who could do some of these things better. And that was a very prevalent situation we found amongst 147 carriers, that there was a lot of sharing the work around. There was a lot of making sure we can find something for Bob to do because Bob's my brother-in-law or because Bob coaches my son in football. So taking that sort of subjectivity away, one of the things you should be understanding is, at a very basic level, how does my freight travel? This is one of the means by which you're going to determine differentiation as well, but it's also going to help you understand which markets you need to be in. If you understand that your freight's going into a mezzanine deck taut liner, which is in the bottom right there, rather than into the back of a Pantechnicon with finger docks, then you're going to know who the people are that are in those markets. You're going to know who to approach to do the work you want. And you're going to know who to approach to do the work for you successfully. And keep in mind that this isn't just a matter of nuancing. You will, in the end, pay for substandard service. You'll pay in that you'll be asking carriers to do things that are out of the norm for them. They'll be causing damages for you. They'll be incurring greater costs because it might require more handling, different handling, out of the loop kind of considerations. That cost will be passed on to you in some way. So, in the short term, Steve had a problem because with 147 carriers, you'd think they knew the market, but we probably had 200 people making the decisions to appoint those 147 carriers. So in the short term, Steve needed help. Steve needed people like us to come and say, yep, we know the market, we can sort out, we can untangle your bucket of spend and tell you where you're spending it and tell you how the market sees where you're spending it and therefore how to approach the market with your bucket of spend. In the longer term, you need to effectively build a knowledge bank. You need to prepare a service specification or service specifications. You need to not wince every time a service provider rings and says, hey, can I come out and talk to you? Can I come out and quote you on your freight? Who's doing your freight? Whatever. Those door knockers, let them in. Get them out and get them talking to you. And then start to develop, as I say, a knowledge bank of who's out there, but starting with a specification of this is what I need done. Now I need to find out who can do it. I need to understand who the sub-markets are. I need to understand who the major players are in those sub-markets so I know who I'm dealing with. Then when it comes time to run a tender, you're not picking up, well, in my day, picking up the phone book, but you're not going to Google and looking for these companies. And I can remember a client in the wine industry who very proudly said he was running an international forwarding tender and proudly said, I've invited 34 companies into this. You know, we'll certainly get a good result out of this. You'll get a lot of paperwork, you'll get a lot of process, good result, another matter. So, I guess to hammer it home, learn who's who out in the market. Okay. This is one of my favourites. There's not a hell of a lot of complication to this, but this is one of the areas where I find, in the project work that I've done, the biggest savings have come from this type of opportunity, this avenue. So we'll explain how, and as I say, it's pretty simple. We could get into a whole lot of charts and so forth and profiles and the like, but I can easily get the concept across to you with just a few examples, I guess. So it really is about how well do your rates fit. And that's talking about how well do your rates fit your profile, your freight profile. So one of the first principles is pay for what you use, or user pay. Now, in the case of Steve, he was sending 14 to 16 tonne tray trucks on a milk run around to various depots, picking up heavy equipment, crates and so on and so forth. Those trucks averaged about 8 tonne per load. Some days they just bypassed or wouldn't even go to some of the depots because they had nothing for them to pick up. So we're running these trucks around, they're half empty, and sometimes they're even more than half empty. Steve had, or his carriers had, charge units, exotic charge units to me, of a crate or large crate, medium crate, whatever. A kilogram is what you're actually being charged for, so try to get a kilogram. And the other is, and this is the more, if you like, complicated piece, is around making sure that you've got synchronisation between your profiles and your rates. So if you've got weight breaks, if you're paying X for the first 2 pallets, Y for the next 3, so on and so forth, understand in which break you send the most freight. In other words, where's your pain point? What's going to give you the biggest bang for your buck? Because a sales rep's going to come in, he's going to do one of 4 things. He's going to come in and he's going to do the right thing, he's going to do some analysis, and he's going to hit the mark with those rates. Or he's going to come in and he's going to give you fantastic rates that don't matter to you, and he's going to give you pretty average rates that do matter to you. Or he's going to look at what their costs are and the imbalances in terms of them positioning their assets around the network, and he'll quote you on that basis. Or he'll pull up the last quote he did and forget your profile and basically copy that. So 3 out of 4 you lose. So if you know that information, then they know you know that information, it's a different picture. Rate competitiveness. There's really only one slide here. That is, know the market. Do your homework, know the market. There's no magic to getting competitive rates. And the last of the 4 was service agreement. This was really the nature of Steve's business and their agreements with their customers. With 147 carriers and 250 accounts, what else could you expect? It was absolutely transactional. You do this, we pay you for it. You do it badly, we won't pay you for it. and why am I getting damages, and why can't you anticipate what I need from you? Smarter people like yourselves understand that some cooperation or collaboration is going to get you a lot further. It's going to get you relationship management. It's going to get you forward planning. It's going to get you continuous improvement if you work that agreement. A lot of people think, yeah, service agreement, contract, you only need a contract when you're in trouble. Contracts really should go in the drawer and be forgotten about. I'm talking about service agreements that have living schedules to them that achieve the sorts of things I've just listed for you. Still up there. Okay, so what have we learned? And yes, for the astute ones, Steve has lost his hair. So I reiterate that these things you can do for yourselves apart from the starting point. If you don't have the knowledge, you need the time to build it. But there are a finite number of ways in which you can find opportunities or you can solve those opportunities. Volume leveraging, it's about identifying the real needs and understanding what's available in the market, those carriers that have a broad suite of services so that they can offer you a consolidation opportunity. Resource and task matching is about understanding your freight from a carrier's perspective in terms of their handling requirements, in terms of the yield they're going to get out of a load, and knowing the various markets and their players. Rate structure and competitiveness are about only paying for what you use and understanding the profiles that are important to you. And the service agreement is about getting value out of the relationship which underpins the service. So, sorry Rob, I'm a minute over, but so, do something about it. Come and talk to me this afternoon. Come and talk to me at lunchtime if you have a need. Thank you.
So thank you for joining us again this week. We really appreciate you giving up your time. We also appreciate getting your comments and feedback. So do please comment below. Ask any questions you like. If there's topics that you'd like in the future, let us know, because that's how we can understand what you'd like to watch. And we actually start making our videos that way. So you know how it works. Our videos come out generally on a Wednesday. If you want to be notified about those, do hit the subscribe button. If you hit that bell, you'll get an automatic notification. And if you've enjoyed this channel, do share the channel, invite your friends. The more the merrier, the more questions we get, the more motivation we get to make more videos on supply chain and logistics. So thanks for dropping in, and we'll see you next week.